Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we're taking a very slow, very gentle stroll back in time to the bustling, often bewildered streets of ancient Rome. Imagine, if you will, that you are a Roman citizen, perhaps a baker, kneading dough in the pre-dawn cool, or a laundress scrubbing tunics by the Tiber. The sun is just peeking over the Capitoline Hill, casting long shadows across the Forum. You hear the distant bray of a donkey, the murmur of early risers, and perhaps, if you listen very closely, the faint, disquieting whisper of an imperial decree. Now, imagine a world where one young man, barely out of his teenage years, decides that one of the most natural human expressions, laughter, should be, well, discouraged, if not outright banned. You might think, surely not. But oh, my sleepy friends, in the sprawling dramatic tapestry of Roman history, stranger things have certainly happened. You probably won't survive this, not because of a gladiatorial combat or a toga mishap, but because of the sheer, gentle absurdity of it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe drop a comment below with where you are and what time it is for you right now. It's always fun to see how far our little history podcast travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, for tonight's very specific and hopefully very soporific journey, begins not with a grand emperor of legend like Augustus or Trajan, but with a figure who, shall we say, brought a rather unique flavor to the imperial purple. We're talking about a young man named Varius Avitus Bassianus, though you probably know him by his more common and far more theatrical moniker. Elagabalus. Born around 203 AD in Emesa, Syria, our protagonist came from a rather distinguished, if religiously intense, family. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, was the sister of Empress Julia Domina, who was herself the powerful wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. So young Elagabalus wasn't exactly a nobody. He had imperial connections, albeit through a rather circuitous route. His real claim to fame, initially, was his role as the hereditary high priest of a local sun god, Elagabal. This was no ordinary deity. Elagabal was worshipped in the form of a large, black, conical stone, a meteorite, in fact, which was believed to have fallen from the heavens. Imagine, if you will, being a teenager, and your full-time job is essentially being the lead singer of a very important rock band. Except the rock is an actual rock, and the band plays hymns to the sun. This was Elagabalus's life, steeped in Eastern mysticism and ritual. Now, how does a teenage high priest from Syria end up on the throne of the most powerful empire in the Western world? Well, dear listener, like many things in Roman history, it involves a healthy dose of political intrigue, a dash of military opportunism, and a very clever, very determined grandmother. After the assassination of Emperor Caracalla, Elagabalus's cousin, and another figure who certainly had his quirks, the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite bodyguard unit, proclaimed Macrinus as emperor. Macrinus was the first emperor who wasn't from the senatorial class, a truly significant break from tradition. But Macrinus wasn't terribly popular, and he wasn't exactly what you'd call emperor material in the eyes of many. This is where Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's shrewd grandmother, saw her opportunity. She began to spread rumors, whispers, gentle fictions that her grandson, Elagabalus, was, in fact, Caracalla's illegitimate son. This was, to put it mildly, a stretch. Caracalla was hardly known for his quiet, familial dalliances, and the timeline was fuzzy. Historians still argue whether there was any genuine belief in this claim, or if it was simply a convenient fabrication. But in the chaotic world of Roman succession, convenience often trumped veracity. Maesa showered the Roman legions stationed in Syria with promises of money, land, and glory, appealing to their loyalty to the Severan dynasty. She presented young Elagabalus, resplendent in his priestly robes, as the rightful heir, wronged by Macrinus. And as so often happens when large sums of money are involved and soldiers are bored, the legions bought it, or at least they pretended to. On May 16, 218 AD, the Legio III Gallica, convinced by Mace's persuasive arguments and even more persuasive gold, proclaimed Elagabalus emperor. He was only 14 years old. Can you imagine? One day you're sacrificing bulls and leading chants. The next you're being told you're in charge of an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. It's like going from being the head of the school chess club to suddenly being president of the world, all before you've even learned to shave properly. The ensuing civil war was brief. Macrinus's forces were defeated, and he himself was captured and executed. And just like that, Rome had a new emperor, a teenage high priest from Syria, who was about to turn the imperial palace into something quite unlike anything Rome had ever seen. The stage was set for a reign that would be remembered not for its military conquests or political stability, but for its sheer, bewildering, and often quietly amusing eccentricity. Get comfortable, this is just the beginning. This is word count 1007. Awaiting continue. So you're a Roman citizen, perhaps a senator who's seen a few emperors come and go, or maybe just a humble merchant selling olives in the Subura. News has just reached you. The new emperor is a Syrian teenager, a high priest of some sun god. Your initial reaction might be a polite cough into your toga, followed by a quiet, incredulous chuckle. After all, Rome had a long, established tradition of emperors. They were often military men, sometimes scholars, occasionally madmen. But they were Roman madmen, with Roman quirks. This new fellow, Elagabalus, was something else entirely. Imagine the collective bewilderment. He wasn't just young. He was an outsider, steeped in what many Romans considered to be exotic, even barbaric religious practices. When Elagabalus finally made his grand entrance into Rome, it was less a triumphal procession and more a cultural shockwave. He arrived not in traditional Roman military attire, as victorious emperors often did, but in the flowing silk robes of his Syrian priestly office. And he brought with him the centerpiece of his religion, the black stone of Elagabal. This wasn't just a religious artifact. It was, in his eyes, the supreme deity. Imagine walking through the Forum and seeing, instead of the venerable statues of Jupiter or Mars, this large, dark, conical rock being paraded with pomp and circumstance. You might scratch your head, wondering if you'd had a bit too much unwatered wine. This was profoundly alien to Roman sensibilities. Roman religion was largely polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each with their specific domain. The idea of one singular, abstract deity, represented by a stone, was quite frankly peculiar. Historians still argue whether the Roman populace was truly offended or simply deeply, deeply confused by this theological import. His very first act as emperor, once he was properly ensconced in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, was not to address state affairs or military campaigns, but to build a massive new temple dedicated to Elagabal. This structure, known as the Elagabalium, was erected on the Palatine itself, a prime piece of real estate traditionally reserved for the most important Roman temples and imperial residences. It was a clear statement of intent. Elagabal was now Rome's chief god, and everyone else, including Jupiter Optimus Maximus, was taking a back seat. You can almost hear the collective gasp from the traditional Roman priests, the Vestal Virgins, and especially the Senate. It was a move that instantly alienated the conservative Roman aristocracy, who valued tradition above almost all else. It was one thing to absorb foreign cults into the vast Roman religious tapestry. Isis and Mithras had found their followers. But it was quite another to dethrone Jupiter and elevate a Syrian meteorite to the top spot. Beyond the religious overhaul, Elagabalus's daily life within the palace quickly became the stuff of legend. though perhaps not the kind of legend one aspires to. He embraced a lifestyle of opulent excess that made even the most jaded Roman aristocrat raise an eyebrow. Dinners, for instance, weren't just meals, they were theatrical productions. He would serve dishes that were outrageously extravagant, sometimes consisting entirely of delicacies like flamingo tongues or parrot heads. Imagine being invited to dinner at the palace and being served a plate of roasted parrot brains. You'd politely nibble, of course, but inside you'd be wondering if perhaps the emperor had confused a cookbook with a birdwatching guide. One quirky tidbit is that he was said to sometimes serve his guests food made of marble, or stones, or even glass, just to see their reactions, while he himself ate more modest fare. It was a strange, subtle form of practical joke, a test of his guests' civility and perhaps their patience. His fashion sense was equally unconventional. Instead of the simple, dignified toga, he favored flowing, colorful silk robes, often embroidered with gold thread, more akin to those worn by his Syrian countrymen, or perhaps by actors on a stage. He would reportedly wear cosmetics and elaborate wigs, which was highly unusual for a Roman emperor, and indeed for any Roman man of standing. It was a deliberate rejection of Roman masculine norms, a playful defiance that both bewildered and quietly scandalized the traditionalists. For a Roman used to seeing their leader in a simple toga, projecting gravitas and military prowess, Elagabalus's appearance must have felt like a performance art piece gone slightly awry. You might have seen more understated attire on a street performer. The Senate, Rome's venerable governing body, found themselves in an increasingly awkward position. They were expected to advise and sanction the emperor, but with Elagabalus, their advice seemed to fall on deaf ears. Or more accurately, ears more attuned to the chanting of Syrian priests than the wisdom of Roman elders. Their power was effectively nullified, replaced by the whims of a teenager. This created a simmering resentment, a quiet tension that permeated the marbled halls of power. For the common Roman, they probably just shrugged. Emperors came and went, and as long as the grain dole was consistent and the gladiatorial games continued, most citizens had bigger things to worry about, like finding a good spot at the public baths or avoiding stepping in chariot dung. But the elite, those who truly felt the pulse of the empire, understood that something profoundly odd was unfolding in their capital, something that threatened the very fabric of Roman identity. As you drift deeper into the peculiar history of Elagabalus, imagine the growing unease in Rome, not just among the elite, but even among those who simply wished for a quiet life. The young emperor wasn't content merely to indulge in personal extravagances. He genuinely believed in the supremacy of his sun god, Elagabal, and intended to make sure everyone in the Roman Empire believed it too. This wasn't just about building a temple on the Palatine. This was about fundamentally altering the very spiritual bedrock of Roman society. His religious reforms were, to put it mildly, aggressive. He ordered that the sacred black stone of Elagabal be placed in the newly built Elagabalium, a temple designed specifically to house it. But he didn't stop there. He commanded that all the most revered Roman religious artifacts be moved into this new temple, effectively making Elagabal the caput rerum, the head of all things in Roman religion. This included the sacred Palladium, a wooden image of Pallas Athena believed to have been brought to Italy by Aeneas himself, and without which Rome was said to be doomed. Imagine the outcry. It would be like a modern leader demanding that all national treasures be moved into a new, personally funded museum for a previously obscure religion. The traditional Roman priests must have been absolutely apoplectic, though likely very quietly so. Elagabalus even attempted to merge the worship of Elagabal with that of Jupiter, the traditional king of the Roman gods. He declared that Elagabal was not just a god, but the god, and Jupiter was merely his minister, or even worse, a lesser deity. This was an outright affront to centuries of Roman religious practice and cultural identity. Historians still argue whether this was a sincere religious conviction on Elagabalus's part, or merely a bizarre power play to assert his absolute authority, even over the gods themselves. Some scholars lean towards genuine fanaticism, suggesting his upbringing as a high priest deeply ingrained this belief. Others see it as a deliberate provocation, a way for a young man who felt like an outsider to stamp his unique mark on a formidable empire. He would personally lead daily rituals in front of the Elagabalus, dressed in elaborate Eastern robes, often with painted eyes and adorned with jewels. These ceremonies involved frenzied dances, public sacrifices, and rather loud music. For the average Roman, accustomed to the more staid and formalized rituals of their own religion, this must have seemed utterly outlandish. Imagine attending a public ceremony and seeing your emperor, the most powerful man in the world, dancing wildly around a giant black rock. You'd probably exchange a bewildered glance with your neighbor, wondering if this was some new experimental form of entertainment. One particularly quirky tidbit that illustrates his religious zeal, or perhaps his peculiar sense of humor, was his desire to marry his god. Yes, you heard that right. Elagabalus arranged a sacred marriage between the black stone of Elagabal and the goddess Urania, or Celestis, a Carthaginian goddess whose cult statue was brought to Rome for the occasion. This was an unprecedented act, taking anthropomorphic religious personification to an entirely new, almost literal level. It was a clear attempt to elevate his god by giving him a divine consort from within the existing Roman pantheon, albeit a somewhat minor one. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperation from the Roman religious establishment. First he moves the Palladium, now he's arranging divine marriages. What's next? A celestial honeymoon? His appointments of officials further highlighted his priorities. He reportedly appointed dancers, barbers, and charioteers to important positions, rather than experienced administrators or military commanders. This was less about meritocracy and more about surrounding himself with people who, perhaps, understood his peculiar worldview or simply amused him. It probably didn't do wonders for the efficiency of the Roman bureaucracy, but it certainly made for interesting dinner party conversation if you were brave enough to whisper about it. You might find your local city magistrate was now a man whose primary skill was styling hair, which, while useful for a good coif, wasn't exactly prime experience for running a province. This period saw a deliberate subversion of Roman traditions, not just in religion, but in everyday life. The emperor's behavior was a constant, gentle provocation. He didn't rule with an iron fist of tyranny in the traditional sense. Rather, he ruled with an odd, almost playful disregard for convention, which in its own way was just as unsettling to the Roman establishment. They valued order, tradition, and decorum, and Elagabalus seemed intent on dismantling all three, often with a mischievous grin. He wasn't overtly cruel to the populace, at least not initially, but his actions created a pervasive sense of unease, a feeling that the world was being turned upside down, one peculiar imperial whim at a time. It's truly something to consider as you drift off. The sheer, quiet bewilderment of an entire empire trying to make sense of their teenage emperor's bewildering devotion to a black rock. Now, as we continue our gentle journey into the heart of Elagabalus's reign, let's pull back the curtain on daily life within his imperial palace. If you were lucky, or perhaps unlucky, enough to be a part of the imperial household, your days would have been a fascinating blend of opulence, absurdity, and quiet trepidation. The palace on the Palatine, usually a place of solemn statecraft, became a stage for Elagabalus's continuous, whimsical performance. Imagine for a moment that you are a humble palace servant, perhaps a chamberlain whose job it is to attend to the emperor's personal needs. Your day might begin not with the familiar clatter of senatorial business, but with the scent of exotic perfumes and the murmur of strange rituals. Elagabalus was known for his extreme indulgence in baths, often filling them with scented wines or rose petals. You might be tasked with preparing these elaborate baths, carefully pouring in gallons of vintage Falernian wine, trying not to imagine how many amphorae of that precious liquid could instead feed a small village. One quirky tidbit is that he was said to sometimes host banquets where the guests were bathed in scented oils and then expected to feast on dishes served on tables made of solid silver, which were then thrown into the Tiber. This wasn't just extravagant. It was a deliberate, almost playful act of waste designed to shock and entertain. His dining habits were legendary, and not always in a good way. While we touched on flamingo tongues, the sheer scale of his culinary excesses bordered on the surreal. He reportedly served peas mixed with gold dust, or rice grains individually dyed and arranged into intricate patterns. Imagine the poor kitchen staff painstakingly coloring each grain of rice. He was also fond of strange and unusual animals, not just for consumption, but often kept as pets within the palace. Lions and leopards roamed freely, or so the stories go, sometimes making rather unexpected appearances during state banquets. You'd be trying to enjoy your peacock brains, only to glance over and see a cheetah strolling past the dessert course. Historians still argue whether these accounts are entirely accurate or embellished tales designed to sensationalize his reign. However, the consistent theme of extraordinary indulgence suggests a core truth to these wild stories. The sleeping arrangements within the palace were equally unconventional. Elagabalus was said to sleep on mattresses stuffed with rabbit fur and goose down, and sometimes even with rose petals, demanding the softest, most luxurious surroundings imaginable. He also had a penchant for arranging bizarre sleeping companions. Legend has it that he would sometimes invite random guests, even common citizens he encountered, to spend the night in the palace, only to wake them up in the middle of the night with a loud trumpet blast and then immediately send them away. This was not a power move. It was simply a whimsical prank, a mild, almost gentle form of psychological mischief. You'd drift off in a luxurious bed, only to be jolted awake by a blaring horn and politely ushered out into the Roman dawn, perhaps wondering if you'd dreamt the whole thing. His personal retinue was a revolving door of performers, charioteers, dancers, and athletes, many of whom he elevated to positions of power. This was a direct insult to the traditional Roman aristocracy, who prided themselves on their lineage and their rigorous training in governance and military affairs. Instead, they found themselves jostling for influence with a former circus performer. This isn't to say these individuals weren't talented in their own fields, but their sudden promotion to roles of imperial influence was profoundly unsettling for the established order. You, as an experienced senator, might find yourself having to defer to someone whose primary skill was driving a two-horse chariot very fast. It certainly made for awkward staff meetings. Even within the palace walls, the atmosphere was one of constant, mild surprise. Elagabalus's whims were unpredictable, his desires often fleeting. One day, he might demand a feast composed entirely of a single color of food. The next, he might order the entire palace staff to wear a specific type of sandal. His gentle humor often manifested as elaborate, expensive pranks. For instance, he was known to invite guests to banquets and then have the dining room floor release a deluge of rose petals, so many that guests were almost buried. While this sounds beautiful, imagine trying to eat a multi-course meal while being slowly submerged in flowers. It was less about malice and more about creating a constantly shifting, dreamlike reality within his immediate environment. It was as if he saw the Roman Empire, or at least his palace, as his personal playground, and its inhabitants merely players in his very expensive, very peculiar game. So, you've settled into the strange, rose-petal-strewn rhythm of Elagabalus's palace. You've seen the exotic animals, perhaps dodged a few stray flamingo feathers, and you're used to the slightly unsettling feeling of being constantly, gently surprised. But now, our story takes an even more peculiar turn, leading us to the heart of tonight's central, most wonderfully boring mystery, the anti-laughter edict. Imagine a balmy Roman afternoon. You're perhaps enjoying a quiet stroll in the gardens, or maybe just watching a particularly clumsy pigeon try to land on a statue. Suddenly, murmurs begin to ripple through the city, not whispers of war or famine or even another bizarre feast, but something far more subtle. News begins to circulate that the emperor, in his infinite and inscrutable wisdom, has decided that public displays of excessive mirth are, well, simply not done. Now, this wasn't a decree that literally forbade all smiling or every chuckle. Historians still argue whether it was a formal, written law or more of a pervasive imperial suggestion, a sort of cultural soft power exerted by a very strange young man. But the effect was clear. An atmosphere of quietude, even solemnity, was expected. The kind of boisterous, open laughter that filled Roman taverns or echoed through the amphitheaters after a particularly good joke was suddenly viewed with suspicion. It was less about absolute prohibition and more about a social chill, a subtle pressure to maintain a certain subdued demeanor, especially in the presence of imperial officials or in public spaces. Why would an emperor, even one as eccentric as Elagabalus, attempt such a thing? The reasons are as hazy and difficult to pin down as a Roman ghost. Some scholars suggest it was tied to his religious beliefs. In some Eastern cults, extreme displays of emotion, particularly public joy, were seen as irreverent or disrespectful to the deities, whose worship often involved more somber, ritualistic fervor. If Elagabal was the supreme god, perhaps the emperor believed that a constant state of mild reverence, rather than boisterous revelry, was more appropriate for his subjects. It's like being in a very serious art gallery where loud conversations are frowned upon, except the art gallery is the entire Roman Empire and the art is the emperor's divine self-expression. Another theory, a delightfully quirky tidbit, posits that Elagabalus himself had a rather peculiar, almost childlike sense of humor. He enjoyed pranks, as we've seen, but perhaps he didn't enjoy being laughed at. Or maybe he simply found the uncontrolled chaos of public merriment to be uncouth or disruptive to his carefully curated, often bizarre sense of order. He might have preferred a world where jokes were subtle, smiles were quiet, and reactions were measured. Much like a meticulous dollhouse owner who prefers all the miniature furniture to remain perfectly still. Imagine telling a joke in the forum and then having to quickly assess if your audience's reaction was a respectful chuckle or an impious guffaw. It added a peculiar layer of social anxiety to everyday interactions. The language used around this edict was not harsh or threatening in the way that decrees about treason or rebellion might be. Instead, it was framed more as a push for decorum, for a certain imperial gravity. You wouldn't be dragged off to prison for a giggle, but you might find yourself quietly admonished, or perhaps simply passed over for a minor promotion if you were seen as too gleeful. This subtle pressure, this unspoken understanding, often has a far more chilling effect on public behavior than overt threats. It creates an atmosphere where people self-police, where a nervous cough replaces a hearty laugh, and a quiet smile is preferred over a booming guffaw. You can almost picture the scene. A group of Roman men, perhaps gathered for a game of dice. One of them tells a truly hilarious anecdote. The other's faces twitch, a smile threatens to break, but then they catch themselves, perhaps remembering a recent imperial pronouncement, or a stern look from a passing praetorian. Instead of roaring with laughter, they might nod sagely or offer a polite, restrained, indeed a most amusing tale. It transformed social interactions into a strange dance of emotional suppression. The impact on Roman entertainment particularly the lively performances in theaters and amphitheaters, must have been profoundly odd. Comedies, which thrived on physical humor and exaggerated expressions of joy, would have faced a unique challenge. How do you make an audience laugh when they are subtly discouraged from doing so? Perhaps the actors became masters of the wry grin, the knowing glance, rather than the slapstick fall. It certainly introduced an element of surrealism to public life. This quiet suppression of public mirth speaks volumes about Elagabalus's reign. It wasn't about conventional tyranny, but about a deep, almost artistic control over the atmosphere of his empire. He wasn't interested in conquering lands. He was interested in conquering the human spirit, at least its outward expressions. And in a sprawling, bustling city like Rome, with its inherent vibrancy and clamor, attempting to put a gentle lid on joy must have been one of the most subtly bizarre imperial initiatives ever conceived. You can feel the quiet hum of unspoken amusement, the stifled giggles, and the slight nervous tension that must have settled over Rome. So, you're in Rome, under the gentle, somewhat stifling influence of Elagabalus's anti-laughter edict. It's not a full-blown ban with harsh penalties for a stray chuckle, but more like a pervasive, unspoken request for a quieter demeanor. How, then, does one enforce such a peculiar imperial suggestion in a city teeming with life, where humor, boisterousness, and the occasional hearty guffaw are as much a part of the cultural fabric as gladiatorial games and public baths? Enforcement, as you might imagine, was a subtle art. It wasn't about Praetorian guards lurking in every alleyway, ready to pounce on an errant grin. Instead, it seems to have relied more on social pressure and the very real, though often unspoken, power dynamics of the imperial court. If you were an ambitious young senator, hoping to catch the emperor's eye for a promotion, you certainly wouldn't risk being seen roaring with laughter at a public event. You'd adopt a more reserved, dignified posture. This kind of self-censorship, driven by career aspirations or social standing, is often far more effective than any direct law. Imagine everyone at a modern office party suddenly deciding, without being told, that loud laughter isn't quite professional. You'd quickly adjust your own volume, wouldn't you? For the common Roman, the impact was likely less severe, but still noticeable. Perhaps a shopkeeper, known for his jolly nature and loud jokes, would find his regular customers exchanging knowing glances, a subtle warning in their eyes. The public reaction was probably a mix of bewildered amusement, quiet compliance, and a fair amount of passive resistance. Romans, after all, were masters of adapting to the whims of their rulers. They'd seen it all. They might not laugh loudly, but they'd certainly develop a rich repertoire of wry smiles, knowing winks, and murmured sarcastic asides. The humor didn't vanish. It simply went underground, becoming more subtle, more conspiratorial. Historians still debate whether this quiet suppression led to an increase in satirical graffiti or whispered jokes in the dark corners of taverns. It's an interesting thought. Did the lack of public laughter make the private jokes even funnier? One particularly quirky tidbit that hints at the type of resistance Elagabalus faced comes from anecdotes about his own experiences. There are tales of him hosting banquets where he would play pranks on his guests, such as releasing wild animals, declawed, one hopes, into the dining hall, or having large quantities of inflated bladders dropped on them from the ceiling, creating a startling crash. The expectation was likely quiet amusement from his guests, but never outright boisterous laughter. The humor was entirely on his terms. Imagine being at one of these elaborate dinners. A lion cub ambles past your plate of dormice, and you're expected to maintain a serene, appreciative expression, perhaps a small, polite smile. It would be a true test of one's poker face. The gentle policing of laughter likely fell to palace officials who, eager to please the young emperor, would gently remind courtiers of the expected decorum. "A little less enthusiasm with that chuckle, old friend," one might whisper to another. a subtle hand gesture indicating the presence of imperial eyes. It wasn't about punishment, but about managing appearances, about maintaining the emperor's unique atmospheric vision for his court. This form of soft control, where the penalty for transgression is social disapproval or a loss of favor rather than a formal charge, can be incredibly powerful in a hierarchical society. The effects rippled outwards, affecting not just the imperial court, but potentially public gatherings. While a gladiator might still draw gasps and cheers, perhaps the witty remarks of a playwright in the theater were met with knowing nods rather than roaring applause. The very cadence of Roman public life might have shifted, a subtle dampening of its vibrant, often raucous energy. Think of it as Rome being put on a perpetual library voice setting. This quiet campaign against open mirth stands in stark contrast to the often violent and brutal actions of other Roman emperors. Elagabalus didn't resort to mass executions or widespread terror to achieve his aims. Instead, he used a more psychological, almost artistic approach to control his environment. He wanted a specific aesthetic for his reign, and that aesthetic, for reasons perhaps known only to him, did not include loud, uncontrolled laughter. It's a fascinating example of how power, even when wielded by a capricious youth, can subtly shape the emotional landscape of an entire civilization. So, as you drift deeper into sleep, ponder the quiet moments of amusement the Romans must have shared, the knowing glances, the stifled giggles, all under the gentle, peculiar gaze of an emperor who preferred his empire just a little less noisy. As you continue your tranquil journey through the Roman Empire under Elagabalus, you're likely wondering, what else did this young emperor get up to, beyond his peculiar religious reforms and his gentle war on laughter? Well, my sleepy friend, his personal eccentricities were legendary, a veritable tapestry of the bizarre that painted his reign with splashes of vibrant, often bewildering color. Imagine Elagabalus himself. He was reportedly incredibly handsome, but he certainly didn't adhere to traditional Roman notions of masculinity. He often dressed in flowing silk robes, adorned with intricate embroidery and jewels, preferring Eastern fashions over the more austere Roman toga. He wore makeup, particularly eye paint, and sometimes even wigs, which would have been a profoundly shocking sight for a Roman emperor, a figure traditionally expected to embody gravitas and military prowess. It's like finding out your country's leader prefers to attend state dinners in full theatrical costume. This wasn't just about fashion. It was a deliberate, almost playful subversion of Roman gender norms, a flamboyant rejection of what was expected. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine expression of his personal identity or another calculated provocation to shock the Roman elite. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a young man testing the boundaries of his immense power. His domestic life was equally unconventional. He reportedly had multiple marriages to both men and women in rapid succession. One particularly famous and quirky tidbit is his marriage to a strong, muscular charioteer named Hierocles, whom he referred to as his husband. He even offered huge sums of money to any doctor who could perform a sex change operation on him, so he could truly be a woman. While such an operation was medically impossible at the time, the very request speaks volumes about his fluid sense of identity and his desire to defy conventions. This was truly groundbreaking for the era, and undoubtedly sent shockwaves through a society deeply rooted in traditional gender roles. Imagine the bewildered whispers among the Roman matrons at the public baths, trying to make sense of their emperor's latest marital arrangement. Beyond his personal appearance and relationships, his daily routines were filled with what can only be described as extravagant pranks and whimsical indulgences. We've mentioned the rose petals, but he also delighted in showering his guests with vast quantities of rare flowers from nets suspended above their dining couches, sometimes to the point of suffocating them. Or imagine being invited to a feast where the dishes were made of incredibly expensive and exotic ingredients, But then you're served fake food, perhaps intricately crafted wax replicas of actual delicacies. He reportedly fed his dogs foie gras and dressed them in elaborate collars, while offering his human guests surprisingly mundane fare, or even worse, food made of straw. It was a constant game of expectation versus reality, a delightful, if slightly unnerving, charade. His sense of humor, as we've established, was a subtle, almost psychological one, often at the expense of his guests. He famously invited a number of bald men to a banquet, and then had them seated at a table reserved for hairy individuals, or invited fat men, and then only served them dishes that were incredibly light and insubstantial. It was less about cruel mockery and more about creating awkward, gently humorous situations. You'd find yourself in a room full of powerful Romans, all trying to maintain their composure while participating in the emperor's latest, mildly embarrassing social experiment. It's a bit like being at a dinner party where the host constantly plays subtle, well-orchestrated practical jokes. He was also obsessed with games and races. Not just chariot races in the Circus Maximus, but often organizing smaller, more bizarre contests within the palace grounds. He might race chariots pulled by exotic animals like dogs or ostriches, or even by scantily clad women. These were not serious athletic events. They were spectacles, designed purely for his amusement. You might be a dignified Roman senator attempting to conduct official business, only to hear the squawking of an ostrich and the shouts of an excited emperor just outside your office window. The quirky tidbit that best sums up his playful disregard for norms is perhaps his habit of releasing snakes into the audience at gladiatorial games. Not venomous ones, of course, but enough to cause a delightful, chaotic scramble. Or his fondness for throwing golden coins into the crowds, only to then order his guards to retrieve them, creating a comical scramble for the same money. Historians still argue whether these actions were born of genuine malice, youthful capriciousness, or a deeper, almost philosophical, desire to expose the absurdities of human nature and social conventions. Perhaps he simply found profound amusement in turning the world on its head, one strange, indulgent whim at a time. And as you feel the gentle pull of sleep, imagine the quiet bewilderment of Romans experiencing this constant, whimsical redefinition of reality. As you continue your tranquil drift through the reign of Elagabalus, our peculiar emperor wasn't content with merely a quiet atmosphere in his capital or strange dining habits. His unique brand of gentle humor often extended to public spectacles, and yes, even peculiar punishments. It was a time when even justice, or what passed for it, could feel like a scene from an absurdist play, all under the watchful, perhaps slightly amused eye of the young emperor. Imagine a Roman courtroom, typically a place of solemnity, or at least a chaotic kind of order. Under Elagabalus, even this could be tinged with the absurd. There are accounts, often whispered and difficult to verify, of him appointing individuals to judicial roles based on their physical attributes, or their ability to perform a particular trick, rather than legal acumen. Imagine presenting your case before a judge whose primary qualification was, say, their ability to juggle 3 apples while reciting poetry. While this might be a delightful spectacle, it probably didn't instill much confidence in the fairness of the legal system. It's like having your traffic court judge be a renowned stand-up comedian, entertaining perhaps, but effective, debatable. His games were not always for amusement alone. Sometimes they were elaborate tests, or even a form of peculiar punishment. One particularly quirky tidbit involves his notorious dinner parties. He was known to invite guests to a lavish banquet, only to then release various wild animals, lions, leopards, or bears, often declawed or defanged, thankfully, into the dining hall. The guests would then scramble in delightful terror, while Elagabalus watched with quiet amusement. While certainly terrifying for the participants, the intent was not usually harm, but rather a unique form of entertainment, designed to elicit a specific fear-tinged reaction, not unlike a modern-day haunted house attraction. Imagine trying to finish your roasted dormouse as a slightly confused but still imposing bear ambles past your table. The heart rate would certainly rise, but presumably the emperor found it all terribly droll. For those who genuinely displeased him, or simply became the target of his capricious whims, the punishments weren't necessarily brutal in the traditional Roman sense of floggings or crucifixions, but they were certainly bizarre. There are tales of individuals being forced to eat excessively rich food until they became ill, or being subjected to an unending series of practical jokes until their patience wore thin. One anecdote describes guests being forced to attend an endless series of theatrical performances that were deliberately dull and repetitive, or being made to watch the same chariot race rerun repeatedly. It was a form of psychological torment, a subtle breaking of the spirit through sheer, monotonous absurdity. Historians still argue whether these accounts are literal truths or exaggerations designed to highlight the emperor's erratic nature. However, the consistent theme of Elagabalus, preferring psychological games over brute force, suggests there's a kernel of truth to these tales. He also famously used his position to play with social hierarchies in amusing ways. He would often dress male servants in women's clothing and female servants in men's clothing, simply for his own amusement during banquets. While perhaps harmless in itself, it was a constant, unsettling blurring of lines for a society that valued strict social order and clearly defined roles. Imagine going to a palace function and not quite being sure who was who or what was expected. It was a gentle, continuous challenge to societal norms, executed with a mischievous grin. Even the architecture of his palace was reportedly designed to facilitate his peculiar games. Hidden trapdoors might open to release exotic birds during a meal, or walls might slide away to reveal unexpected performances. It was a space designed for constant, playful disorientation, making every visit a potential adventure into the unknown. You might find yourself enjoying a quiet conversation, only for a hidden mechanism to drop a cascade of flower petals on your head, or perhaps a net full of live fish. It was less about malice and more about Elagabalus creating his own personal living theater. The atmosphere around these punishments or games was rarely one of genuine terror. Instead, it was tinged with a sense of the surreal, a feeling that you were part of an elaborate, slightly bewildering performance. Elagabalus, in his own strange way, was a performance artist, and the Roman elite were his unwitting audience. As you drift off, consider the peculiar nature of an emperor who preferred to punish with playful humiliation and bizarre spectacles. Rather than with traditional cruelty, a truly unique approach to imperial power. As you settle deeper into the soft cushions of sleep, let's shift our gaze slightly from the emperor himself and consider a figure who, though often in the background, played an absolutely pivotal role in this unfolding drama: Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's formidable grandmother. While Elagabalus was busy orchestrating his bizarre banquets and peculiar edicts, Maesa was quietly, shrewdly navigating the treacherous currents of Roman politics, attempting to maintain some semblance of stability in her grandson's increasingly chaotic reign. Imagine Julia Maesa as the ultimate political matriarch. She was a Syrian woman, shrewd, intelligent, and possessed of an almost terrifying political acumen. It was her cunning, remember, that propelled young Elagabalus onto the throne in the first place, spreading those convenient rumors about his parentage and lavishing gold on the legions. She understood the intricate dance of power in Rome far better than her impulsive grandson ever could. She was the quiet force behind the scenes, pulling strings, whispering advice, and often, undoubtedly, sighing deeply at her grandson's latest antics. Maesa's role was complex. On one hand, she was fiercely loyal to her family and determined to maintain the Severan dynasty's hold on the imperial purple. On the other, she must have quickly realized that Elagabalus's increasingly outlandish behavior was not just embarrassing, but genuinely destabilizing the empire. Historians still argue whether she genuinely believed in his divine right, or if she simply saw him as a convenient, albeit unruly, puppet to reclaim power for her family after Caracalla's assassination. Perhaps it was a gradual, dawning realization that her chosen instrument was, shall we say, a little too unique. She knew Rome. She understood its traditions, its power structures, and the conservative nature of its elite. While Elagabalus was alienating the Senate with his religious reforms and his cross-dressing, Maesa was likely making quiet overtures, trying to smooth ruffled feathers and reassure the powerful figures that not all hope was lost for the empire. Imagine her, perhaps sipping a quiet cup of watered wine, listening to a senator's exasperated complaints about the latest imperial banquet, and offering a calming, measured response, even as her own stomach probably churned with anxiety. It's like having a brilliant, pragmatic political strategist constantly trying to clean up after a wild, unpredictable rock star. One particularly quirky tidbit about Maesa is how she subtly tried to introduce some form of normalcy back into the imperial line. As Elagabalus grew more erratic, she began to realize that his reign was unsustainable. It threatened not only his own life, but the future of her entire dynasty. She hatched a plan, a classic Roman political maneuver. She convinced Elagabalus to adopt his cousin, Severus Alexander, as his heir and to grant him the title of Caesar. Her argument was seemingly innocuous. Elagabalus was young, beautiful, and dedicated to his god. He needed more time for his religious duties and private life. A younger, more traditional co-ruler would allow him this freedom. Now, why would Elagabalus agree to this? He was perhaps naive, easily swayed by his grandmother, whom he largely trusted. Or perhaps he truly longed for more time for his peculiar religious ceremonies and personal indulgences, unburdened by the mundane tasks of governance. Historians still argue whether he fully grasped the implications of this adoption, or if he saw Alexander more as a plaything or a convenient prop than a genuine threat to his power. Maesa, however, knew precisely what she was doing. Severus Alexander was everything Elagabalus was not: quiet, studious, respectful of Roman traditions, and crucially, palatable to the Roman Senate and the Praetorian Guard. This adoption was a masterstroke, a subtle, almost invisible shift of power. It presented a viable, traditional alternative to Elagabalus's increasing instability. While our emperor was busy with his sacred stone and his questionable fashion choices, his shrewd grandmother was quietly laying the groundwork for his eventual and inevitable downfall. She was the ultimate pragmatist in a court filled with bizarre idealism. Her influence, though less flamboyant than Elagabalus's, was ultimately far more enduring and significant for the fate of Rome. So, as you continue to drift off, picture this astute woman weaving her intricate web of political maneuvering, a quiet counterpoint to the loud, peculiar reign of her grandson. As Julia Maesa quietly maneuvered her pieces on the Roman political chessboard, the very air in the Eternal City began to thicken with whispers. You, as a Roman citizen, whether a humble shopkeeper or a dignified senator, would have felt it. A growing sense of unease, a quiet discontent that simmered just beneath the surface of the emperor's peculiar reign. This wasn't the roar of open rebellion yet, but rather the rustling of discontent, the subtle turning of heads and the knowing glances exchanged in hushed tones. The reasons for this burgeoning discontent were manifold. Firstly, Elagabalus's religious innovations continued to be a constant source of irritation, particularly for the conservative Roman elite. The elevation of the black stone of Elagabal to supreme deity status, the public rituals that seemed so alien and undignified, and the apparent demotion of Rome's ancient gods, all these chipped away at the loyalty of those who valued tradition above all else. Imagine attending a public festival dedicated to Jupiter, only to find it subtly overshadowed by some new, bizarre ceremony. It wouldn't inspire revolutionary fervor, perhaps, but certainly a deep, quiet sigh of cultural despair. Historians still argue whether the religious reforms were the primary cause of his unpopularity, or simply a highly visible symptom of his broader disregard for Roman norms. Beyond religion, his extravagant spending was a growing concern. While emperors often spent lavishly, Elagabalus's expenditures seemed to serve no public good. The construction of his grand Elagabalium, the endless exotic banquets, the gifts of pearl-strewn mattresses, all this drained the imperial treasury without any discernible benefit to the empire or its citizens. You, as a taxpayer, might grumble quietly about the cost of flamingo tongues when public roads needed repair, or when the grain dole seemed less generous than it once was. The Roman people, while generally tolerant of imperial whims, did expect their emperors to maintain a degree of fiscal responsibility. This constant, frivolous drain on resources was a legitimate grievance, fostering a quiet sense of resentment. His appointments of unqualified individuals to positions of power also grated on the nerves of the established Roman bureaucracy and aristocracy. To see former charioteers or dancers wielding significant administrative authority was an affront to the meritocratic, or at least lineage-based, principles of Roman governance. Imagine having to seek justice from a man whose only discernible skill was his ability to tell a passable joke. It undermined the credibility of the entire system. This created a sense of instability and frustration among those who truly understood how the empire was supposed to function, or at least how they believed it should function. The emperor's personal behavior, too, was a constant source of scandal and quiet outrage, particularly among the more traditional elements of Roman society. His flamboyant attire, his public cross-dressing, and his multiple unconventional marriages were seen as not just eccentricities, but as an affront to Roman values of dignity and masculine gravitas. The whispers would fly. Did you hear what the emperor wore to the Senate meeting today? A silk toga with sequins. While modern sensibilities might view this differently, for a Roman of the 3rd century AD, it was deeply unsettling, a sign that the very fabric of society was fraying. One quirky tidbit is the rumor that he would sometimes offer vast sums of money to anyone who could find him a suitable male consort, publicly flaunting his non-traditional preferences in a way that simply defied Roman expectations of imperial decorum. Julia Maesa, ever the pragmatist, saw these currents of discontent building. She understood that if Elagabalus continued on his path, not only would he be overthrown, but her entire family, the Severan dynasty, might be swept away with him. This is precisely why she initiated the strategic adoption of his cousin, Severus Alexander. She presented Alexander, quiet and studious, as a foil to Elagabalus's excesses, a gentle promise of a return to Roman tradition. Her intent was to redirect the growing whispers of discontent away from the family entirely and towards a chosen successor who was more palatable to the Roman establishment. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the Senate when Alexander was presented, a quiet hope that the imperial ship might finally be righted. The whispers intensified, but now they carried a different tone, hope rather than despair.